I love what Sony's done with the build here. The Xperia 1 Mark V feels very different in hand. These days we have two different types of builds. We either have glass backs that are premium but slippery and fingerprint magnets, or we get the fall leather finishes where the material they've used is not premium but it feels good in hand, it's grippy, it's totally fingerprint resistant. Sony's kind of got the best of both worlds here. They've gone with the Gorilla Glass Victus back, but the back has some texture to it which makes the 1 Mark V quite grippy in hand. It also has a matte finish, making this phone totally resistant to fingerprints and smudges. Even the metal frame has some texture which feels nice in hand, and this in-hand feel is better thanks to Sony continuing to use a narrow 21:9 panel. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Here's a comparison with the S23 Ultra. See how the phone is about as tall but much narrower? So the 1 Mark V it's easier to hold and use single-handed. Now, Sony continues to be Sony with the build, and by that I mean there is still support for a headphone jack, you still get micro SD, the only brand to continue to support it with their flagships. There's an IP6568 rating for ingress protection, the two-stage shutter key that we've always loved, that returns, and that also means sadly the fingerprint scanner continues to be built into the power key instead of being under the display. Hey guys, Ash here from C40 Tech. I've been using this phone as my primary for over 10 days. And today, in this video, let's take a look at the pros, the cons, and everything else Xperia 1 Mark V. Now let me start with something interesting. Globally, Sony sells just this. In China, they sell this. Basically, this box includes the bare bones Xperia 1 Mark V box, same as what's sold globally. But alongside that, we also get a tempered glass screen protector, a case with a kickstand, Sony's LinkBuds TWS, and here's the kicker, the global pricing for the phone alone is $1,399. The Chinese pricing for this 1 Mark V bundle is $150 cheaper at 8,999 yuan. Now the unboxing experience is pretty bare bones. You have the phone, some leaflets, and that's it. No SIM tool since you don't need one. No data cable or no charger since they don't want to provide us one. What do you guys think of this? A $1,400 phone without anything but the phone in the box. Fair? Unfair? Do you think they should stop providing a box and just give us the phone? Let me know in the comments. Now the display here, I'd call it a bit of a mixed bag. Let me explain. On the pro side, this is one of the most pixel dense panels available. Sony calls it 4K, it's not 2160p, but it's still well above Quad HD Plus in terms of resolution. The pixel density here is 643 pixels per inch. But you aren't really seeing that now. It only kicks in under certain scenarios, like when you're looking at a picture or watching a video. For the rest of the time, this display runs at Full HD Plus. Now this isn't news to anyone following Sony. They've been using this resolution switch strategy for 8 years now. Yes, you heard me right, 8 years. They started doing this all the way back in 2016 with the Xperia Z5 Premium, which beat it up had an actual 2160p 4K screen, meaning it had an insane 803 pixels per inch pixel density. Okay, enough with the history lessons. Let's get back to why I call this a bit of a mixed bag. The peak brightness, very respectable, 1300 nits. It's good for outdoor use, but it's not as high as what we get with other flagships. The refresh rate, very respectable, 120 Hz, but there is no LTPO technology. You can either leave it at 60 or turn on 120. The touch sampling rate, 240 Hz, which is respectable, but again, we've been seeing higher with other flagships. Now the panel size too, 6.5 inches, respectable, but still smaller than what most flagships offer these days, especially when you take the aspect ratio into account. Personally, I really love this panel. I love the overall footprint of this phone. But people these days seem to be favoring larger screens, which is why you keep seeing brands going bigger and bigger. So this might not be everyone's cup of tea. Now under the hood though, Sony is super competitive. The Xperia 1 Mark V is powered by Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. It's paired with 12 gigs of LPDDR5X RAM and 256 or 512 gigs of UFS 4.0 storage. If you've seen this video of mine, you'd see how Sony's been very conservative with thermals. Traditionally, Sony phones have been very quick to throttle and turn off features like high refresh. This used to happen even with regular use. For example, when I initially set up Sony phones in the past, 120Hz would get disabled. That doesn't happen anymore. Right from the time I set up this phone, throughout the 10 days I spent with it, I never had the high refresh auto disable or have the camera turn off mid video call. With the Xperia 1 Mark IV, it's happened to me. Now that's not to say the 1 Mark V is a gaming phone. Stability is still not great, not gaming phone grade, but the performance is pretty good for the occasional game. The battery life was also excellent. Sony's gone with a 5000 mAh battery here. With my type of moderate usage, I usually would end my days with at least 30% or more left in the tank. When it's time to charge, there is support for wireless charging, but wired is still limited to 30 watts. 0 to 50 in 30 minutes, it's not too bad, but for a $1,400 flagship, I really think a lot of us would have liked to see Sony improve this. On the software side of things, as I mentioned earlier, I bought this phone in China, and in China there's an interesting thing Sony's been doing. I'm sure you know you can't sell phones with Google's Play Store in China, right? So what most brands like Xiaomi or Oppo do is they offer their own app stores. But given Sony has a negligible market share in China, instead of spending resources on setting up their own store, they've instead tied up with Meizu, and they provide Meizu's app store along with some of their Flyme apps. Now don't worry, all my testing was done on global firmware, since flashing a Sony phone from China with Taiwan or Hong Kong firmware, it's a simple enough process. It's also a 100% conversion, meaning you will continue to get updates. It would be as if you bought the phone from Hong Kong or Taiwan with proper Google support. Talking about that software, the Xperia 1 Mark V runs on a near stock version of Android. There are a few extra features like Sony's SightSense, which are usually more useful than bloaty. With SightSense, for example, we can double tap this to launch a sidebar, and from here either launch floating apps or split the screen and run two apps side by side, which, given this tall aspect ratio, it's surprisingly comfortable to use. Of course, all this is not new, it's been around for a while, but it runs very smoothly here on the 1 Mark V. It's also worth noting there are very few apps preloaded, mostly Sony's own. There are some third-party ones like Tidal and Facebook, which sadly are not uninstallable, but you can disable them, and for the most part, the software experience was clean. The 1 Mark V felt very snappy and responsive to use. Okay, let's now move on to arguably the most important aspect of this phone, the cameras. There's a triple camera array to the back. The primary is a 52 megapixel Sony IMX888. This is the big upgrade. Now, why is it a big deal? It's because this is the first time we are seeing a stacked CMOS sensor with two-layer transistor pixel technology. If you're wondering what that means, simply put, this sensor is supposed to be able to collect light better. This sensor is 1.7 times larger than the one we find on the 1 Mark IV, and it's paired with a 24mm f1.9 lens. Under good light, it performs quite well. Do keep in mind that most of these samples were taken just after a dust storm, so it was pretty overcast and foggy. To give you some extra perspective, here are the same images side by side with ones taken by the Galaxy S23 Ultra. Now at first glance, it's immediately noticeable that Samsung captures brighter images, definitely more contrasty. Sony's processing, it's not that heavy. Now when you zoom in, the detail levels, as long as the light is good, are comparable. There are some times where Sony gets the white balance wrong. See here how the Xperia has a pinkish hue. We again see it in this set. It doesn't always happen, but Xperia is more prone to this behavior from time to time. Now under low light, these days Sony do offer a night mode, and they do use multi-frame noise reduction to stitch together good looking pictures, but their software processing seems to lag behind the competition. For example, see here, see how blown out the sharp lights are? This is the same image taken by a S23 Ultra. Even with detail, just look at the road. You can immediately notice the S23 Ultra do much better. Now video is one of this phone's biggest strengths. It can't do 8K, but personally I don't think that's a big deal. 4K 60 can be done, and it's excellent. It's not just that the video footage is good, the software that Sony provides for this is amazing. Let's just look at one feature here, rack focus. This is a technique you see pretty much everywhere with movies and TV shows. You can actually do that with the Xperia 1 Mark V. Now with the Cinema app, tap on focus, tap where you want your first focus point to be. Let's call it A. Then tap the next focus point, call it B. Now tap A and the focus gets pulled to A. Tap B and we get a smooth focus pull to B. These are the kind of shots you can end up shooting on the Xperia 1 Mark V. Sony also allows for 4K 120fps slow motion shooting 21:9. There are multiple LUTs you can choose from. There's a whole lot of enthusiast features baked in here. And therein lies this phone's biggest advantage. If you're a video enthusiast, a pro user, then there's a lot to benefit. But if you're someone who just points and clicks, then as you can see, the automatic software processing, it's not that great. Anyways, moving on, the other two sensors remain unchanged from the last time around. There's a 12 megapixel IMX650, which is paired with a 85 to 125mm variable focal length lens with OIS. So you get continuous optical zoom between 3.5x and 5.2x. I still am not a fan of the zoom results. The images kind of look soft in comparison to what you can get with, say, something like the S23 Ultra again. Just compare these shots. Keep in mind the Sony is all optical, whereas Samsung is doing a bit of digital zoom at times to match. The Samsung still manages to stay far ahead. The ultrawide remains a 12 megapixel Sony IMX563 and it continues to do reasonably well. For selfies, we have another 12 megapixel sensor, the IMX664. This one's paired with a fixed focus f2 lens. The results are pretty decent. Once again, the software processing, be it portraits or HDR, it does lag behind the competition. So overall, there is a lot to love about this phone. Sony's finally fixed the annoying quirks that we've been seeing for the last few generations. The phone runs cool, it's got microSD support, a headphone jack, an amazing display. It's very easy to hold and use and offers excellent battery life. But for an asking price of $1,400, that is a tough pill to swallow. That's $200 over the S23 Ultra or $300 over the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So when you think about it, if you're a diehard Sony fan or you have the need for the pro video functions this camera offers, so maybe then the Xperia 1 Mark V, it could be the right phone for you. But for the vast majority of us, this is a good phone that we can look at and say, wow, Sony's done really well. Man, this is a good phone. But it isn't one we are going to be buying. At least that's my take on it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye now.